You've been described as a very big man, but you're a disgusting and despicable small man, if you're a man at all. And you're a coward. I know that you're sorry that you got caught. I assume that you're sorry for what you've done to your wife and children. Are you a little bit sorry for what you did to these poor innocent women? 8 women that you strangled to death, at least 8 that we know of. Are you at least a little bit sorry for that? Yes?
Yes, I am.
For over 2 decades, a predator walked freely among ordinary people. He commuted to work every morning, paid his bills, sat at the dinner table with his family, and smiled at his neighbors. He was invisible. He was unremarkable. And behind that carefully constructed mask of normalcy, he was one of the most prolific serial killers in the history of the state of New York. 8 women lost their lives, 8 families were shattered, and for more than 10 years, no one was ever charged. No one was ever held accountable. No one even had a name. But on a warm day in June of 2026, inside a packed Long Island courtroom, the silence finally broke. The families finally spoke, and the monster finally heard the words that would seal the rest of his days behind bars forever. This is the story we are telling today on TrueCrimeWeb. Stay with us. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to TrueCrimeWeb, the channel dedicated to telling the full story, not just the headlines, but the human beings behind them. If this is the kind of in-depth, carefully researched storytelling you have been looking for, please take a moment right now to like this video. Drop a comment letting us know your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story. Now, let us go back to where this all began, because to truly understand the weight of what happened inside that courtroom on June the 17th, 2026, you have to understand the long and painful road that led every single person there. The year was 2010. A young woman named Shannon Gilbert, just 23 years old, had been working as an escort on Long Island, New York. On the night of May the 1st, Shannon was at a client's home in the seaside community of Oak Beach when something went terribly wrong. She called 911 in a state of absolute panic, her voice barely holding together, crying out that someone was after her. And then, as suddenly and as completely as a candle being snuffed out in the dark, Shannon Gilbert vanished.
State police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
Search teams were deployed. Police combed the surrounding area along the shores of Gilgo Beach, a quiet stretch of coastline on Long Island's South Shore. And what they found in those marshlands changed everything. While searching for Shannon, investigators stumbled upon something far darker, far more chilling, and far more devastating than anyone could have prepared for. Concealed within the overgrown brush and thick coastal terrain, they discovered the remains of not one victim, but 4 women. 4 women who had been left there, discarded, as though their lives had meant nothing at all. These 4 women would come to be known as the Gilgo Four. Their names were Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Amber Costello, Megan Waterman, and Melissa Barthelemy. Each of them had been working as an online escort. Each of them was young, petite, and in her 20s. And each of them had simply disappeared from the lives of people who loved them, leaving behind a silence so loud that their families could barely breathe through it. As investigators processed what they had found, the grim conclusion became unavoidable. They were not dealing with isolated incidents. They were dealing with a serial killer. The hunt for the man who would become known as the Long Island serial killer had officially begun. Shannon Gilbert's remains were discovered approximately 1.5 years later. After a careful investigation, authorities concluded that her death had been a tragic accident, likely an accidental drowning, and that it was not connected to the murders of the other women. But those 4 women, and the additional victims that would later be identified, were a different story entirely. In the months and years that followed that initial discovery, investigators worked to build a profile of the killer. They were looking for patterns, for connections, for anything that might point them in the right direction. And there were clues. There were threads sitting right there in the case files waiting to be pulled. A roommate of Amber Costello had spoken to police shortly after Amber's disappearance. She described the last client Amber had gone to meet that night. She said he was a very large man, a man she described with a single unforgettable word. She called him an ogre. She also said that he drove a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck. Police also knew from their investigation that a client had used what is called a burner phone, a prepaid disposable cell phone that is very difficult to trace, to contact Amber Costello on the very night she disappeared. And here is where it gets even more significant. Investigators discovered that Maureen, Melissa and Megan had also been in contact with burner phone numbers in the hours immediately before each of them vanished. Someone was using these phones deliberately. Someone who understood, at least on some level, how to cover their tracks. Despite these leads, despite these threads, the investigation slowed to a crawl and then, heartbreakingly, it stalled almost completely. For over 10 years, the families of these women waited. They held vigils. They gave interviews. They kept the names of their loved ones alive the best they could, refusing to let the world forget. Maureen Brainard-Barnes' sister, Missy, was a constant and tireless advocate, carrying not only the weight of grief, but also a burden of guilt that she would later describe in court in words that left not a single dry eye in the room. The last time she spoke to her sister, Maureen had called her from Penn Station late at night, asking for a ride home. Missy was living in Connecticut. It was late, the drive was long, and so she said no. That was the last conversation they ever had. That kind of guilt is the kind that does not leave a person. It settles into the bones and stays there. What finally broke the case open, after more than a decade of near silence, was a decision made in 2022 by the newly appointed Suffolk County Police Commissioner, a man named Rodney Harrison. Commissioner Harrison was a retired high-ranking New York City police detective, and he came into his new role with fresh eyes and a determined resolve. He established a dedicated task force, a team of investigators whose sole mission was to crack this case. And almost immediately, the task force began to see what others had missed, or rather, they began to connect what had always been there, sitting patiently in those original case files, waiting for someone to put the pieces together. With the assistance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the task force went back through the phone records, connected to those burner phones, and made a crucial discovery. Most of the calls made from those disposable phones had pinged off cell towers concentrated in a remarkably small geographic area on Long Island, a neighborhood in a community called Massapequa Park. Investigators quietly called this area the Box. Suddenly the picture began to sharpen. They were looking for a large, powerfully built man who lived inside that small geographic box, who had owned a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche at the time the murders were committed, and who, based on cell tower data, also spent significant time in Midtown Manhattan, almost certainly for work. In March of 2022, a female state trooper made the connection that would change everything. She linked a man named Rex Heuermann, a resident of Massapequa Park, to a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck that had been registered in his name during the precise years the murders had taken place. The task force had their suspect, but having a suspect and being able to charge a suspect are two very different things. What investigators needed was physical evidence, and specifically, they needed DNA. Rex Heuermann had no prior criminal record, which meant his genetic profile existed in no law enforcement database anywhere in the country. So investigators did what good detectives do. They got creative. They began conducting surveillance on Heuermann, and in a moment that would prove pivotal to the entire case, they observed him discard a half-eaten pizza crust on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan. Under the law, an object that has been thrown away in a public space is considered abandoned, which means law enforcement can legally retrieve it and test it for DNA without a warrant. Officers recovered that pizza crust. They tested it, and when the results came back, the DNA profile extracted from that discarded crust was consistent with the DNA profile of a male hair that had previously been found with the remains of Megan Waterman. The puzzle was complete. Rex Heuermann was arrested in July of 2023. The community of Massapequa Park was stunned. Neighbors who had lived next door to Heuermann for years came forward with recollections that, in hindsight, painted a chilling portrait. One neighbor described him as very quiet, very dark, someone who kept entirely to himself, but who radiated an intensity that made people uncomfortable. Reports emerged of Heuermann swinging an axe in his front yard while glaring at passing neighbors. Parents in the neighborhood had long since quietly warned their children not to knock on his door on Halloween. He had been a known hunter who kept a significant collection of firearms inside his home. And yet, to the outside world, he had also been something else entirely. He was a professional. He ran his own architectural consulting firm in Midtown Manhattan. He commuted to the city every day. He had a stepson and a daughter with his wife, Asa Ellerup, a woman who had been born in Iceland and who would take the children back to visit her family there during the summers. It was during those trips, and during other absences of his family, that investigators believe Rex Heuermann carried out the majority of his crimes. His now ex-wife filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. Her attorney released a statement, confirming that she had been just as blindsided as everyone else, a claim that, while it might seem difficult to comprehend, is consistent with what has been documented in many other cases, involving serial killers who live double lives beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary family arrangements. When Heuermann was first charged, he was facing multiple counts of murder in the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He entered a plea of not guilty. In 2024, additional charges were filed connecting him to the deaths of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Sandra Castilla, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack. Again, he pleaded not guilty. The case was scheduled to go to trial in September of 2026, with prosecutors preparing to call more than 100 witnesses across what promised to be an extraordinarily long and emotionally grueling proceeding. But then, in April of 2026, almost 3 full years after his arrest, Rex Heuermann walked into court and changed his plea. He admitted to killing 7 women between 1993 and 2011. He also admitted to killing an 8th woman, a victim named Karen Vata, though as part of the negotiated plea agreement, he was not formally charged with her murder. The victims whose deaths he formally pleaded guilty to were Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castilla, and Valerie Mack. 7 women, 7 lives, 7 families who had been waiting, in some cases for more than 30 years, for someone to be held accountable. Among the most chilling details that emerged from the investigation was the discovery of what prosecutors described as a blueprint, a handwritten document allegedly created by Heuermann to help plan and organize his crimes with a level of methodical, calculated precision that is deeply disturbing to contemplate. The document was divided into 4 columns, each with a heading. The headings were labeled as follows: problems, supplies, and 2 abbreviations that investigators believe stood for dump site and targets. Under the column marked problems, Heuermann had reportedly listed items including DNA, tire marks, and bloodstains. The existence of such a document reflects not just the commission of terrible crimes, but a mind that was actively engaged in refining, improving, and perpetuating those crimes over a period of 17 years. Investigators note that Heuermann's methods evolved and shifted over time, a sign that he was paying close attention to both his own actions and to the progression of the investigation around him. He was, in the most unsettling sense of the phrase, learning from his own crimes as he went. Since his arrest, reporting has emerged about how Heuermann has been spending his days in custody. The Suffolk County Sheriff noted publicly that Heuermann became a voracious reader during his time in jail, with a particular preference for violent crime fiction and mystery novels, including some that feature serial killers as central characters. Perhaps more disturbing was a report that Keith Hunter Jesperson, a convicted killer known by the nickname the Happy Face Killer, who is currently serving multiple life sentences in Oregon, reached out to Heuermann by personal letter. Heuermann did write back once, though he did not respond to several follow-up letters from Jesperson. It is a stark and unsettling reminder that notoriety, even the notoriety of imprisonment, carries its own dark currency in certain circles. As part of his plea agreement, Heuermann also agreed to cooperate with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the department responsible for analyzing the psychological motivations of violent offenders, developing criminal profiles, and assisting in the solving of complex cases. This particular element of the agreement is, by virtually any legal measure, extraordinarily unusual. Legal analysts who have followed the case closely have noted that they have simply never encountered this kind of cooperation clause in a plea agreement before. It speaks to just how significant a figure Heuermann is in the landscape of American criminal history, and it raises the very real possibility that what investigators learn from him could one day help identify and stop other predators before they cause the kind of devastation that Rex Heuermann caused across nearly 2 decades of violence. On June the 17th, 2026, Rex Heuermann was brought into court for sentencing. He sat at the defense table, largely still, his hands folded one over the other, his eyes frequently cast downward. He showed very little emotion throughout the proceedings. His ex-wife, Asa Ellerup, was not present. Her attorney released a statement on her behalf which read, in part, that she believed the day should be centered entirely on the victims, their families, and the profound impact these crimes had had on their lives, and that she did not wish her presence to distract from the purpose of those proceedings. It was, by most accounts, a dignified and thoughtful decision under circumstances that were anything but ordinary. What followed was one of the most emotionally raw and unforgettable series of victim impact statements that anyone present that day had ever witnessed in a court of law. The families of these women had waited for this moment, some of them for well over a decade, and they were not going to let it pass without being fully, completely, and powerfully heard. The first statement came from Joanne Mack, the adoptive mother of Valerie Mack, who had disappeared in the year 2000. Standing before the court, Joanne Mack spoke with the quiet, composed devastation of a woman who had long since made peace with her grief, even if she could never make peace with its cause. She told Heuermann that even though justice had now been done, it could not replace what he had taken from their family, and it could not give their beloved Valerie back her life on this earth. And then she said something remarkable. She told him that no matter what sense of power or control he had believed he held over Valerie's body, he had never been able to touch her soul.
Even though justice is done, it cannot replace what you have taken from us. Or can it give our beloved Valerie back her life here on earth? I do, however, want you to understand that even though you were able to commit these horrendous atrocities against our daughter, and no matter what sense of power or control you felt over Valerie's body, you were never able to touch her soul.
Jasmine Robinson, a cousin of Jessica Taylor who had been killed in 2003, was overcome with emotion as she faced the courtroom. The date of the sentencing hearing also happened to be Jessica's 43rd birthday, a detail that added yet another layer of unbearable weight to an already unbearable day. Through tears, Jasmine described a visceral and devastating grief that she said defied easy language, and she spoke of the horror she had felt as more and more victims were identified over the years, each new name expanding the circle of loss and pain.
The words, the eviscerating loathing I have for you, my heart broke even more that there were more victims. Sick, twisted, heartless. There aren't enough words for these murders.
Missy Kent, the sister of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, spoke about something that many people in that courtroom may not have fully considered before she gave voice to it. She said that when Rex Heuermann chose to take Maureen's life, he did not just take Maureen from her family. He took something from Missy herself. He took her sense of safety. He took her peace of mind. He took the way she had once moved through the world without fear. And then she said quietly, and with devastating clarity, that in many ways she had become one of his victims too.
When Rex chose to take Maureen's life, he didn't just take her from us. He took my sense of safety. He took my peace of mind. He took the way I used to move through the world without fear. In many ways, I became one of his victims too.
Maureen's son, Dylan, who had been just 1 year old at the time of his mother's murder, also addressed the court. He spoke of growing up without her during every moment he had ever needed a mother's presence, and he spoke of the grief of knowing she never got to see who he had become. Maureen's daughter, Nicolette Brainard-Barnes, began her statement with love for her mother, and then turned the full force of her anger directly onto the man sitting across the room from her. She told Heuermann that he was a pathetic man who needed to believe that certain women were less than human because he was a coward who took out his own failures and shortcomings on others. She told him she felt sorry for him because his capacity for hatred meant he could never possibly understand love, and specifically the pure and enduring love she still carried for her mother. She told him that seeing the smirk on his face when he had finally confessed proved everything anyone needed to know about why he needed to be locked away forever. And she ended her statement with 4 words that were both a declaration and a verdict of her own. She said, "I do not forgive you."
You're a pathetic man who thinks you're better than women. You need to believe that sex workers are subhuman because you're a coward who takes out your own shortcomings on others. I feel bad for you because your capacity for hate means that you can't possibly understand love, the purity of it, the kind of love I had and still have for my mother. Seeing your last court appearance and the way you smirked as you finally confessed to what you did to my mother proves that you need to be locked away for the safety of the community. There are no words extreme enough to communicate the level of depravity within you. You make me sick and I don't forgive you.
Megan Waterman's daughter, Liliana, who goes by Lily, was visibly overcome with emotion as she began to speak. She noted something that stopped the courtroom cold. She was now the same age that her mother had been when she was pregnant with her. Think about that for a moment. The daughter had grown up to become the age her mother was when she brought her into the world, and her mother had been gone for most of that journey. Lily also spoke with remarkable honesty and real pain about the experience of having her mother's murder become public property, discussed in articles, documentaries, podcasts, and across social media, sometimes by people who, in Lily's words, were profiting from the tragedy her family had lived through. She said she was grateful that people wanted to say her mother's name and seek justice for her, but she drew a firm and meaningful line between remembering who someone was and using their story for personal gain.
For years, my mother's murder has been discussed in articles, television specials, podcasts, and across social media. There are weeks when I cannot bring myself to open any social apps because I'm constantly confronted with reminders of the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I am grateful that people want to say her name and seek justice for her, but there's a difference between remembering who she was and profiting off of the tragedy that she's been.
And then there was Amanda Pluthero, the younger sister of Melissa Barthelemy. Amanda was 15 years old when Melissa disappeared in 2009. Shortly after, she received a phone call that appeared to be coming from her sister's cell phone. She answered it, expecting to hear Melissa's voice. Instead, she heard a man who threatened to do to Amanda what he had already done to Melissa. That man, investigators now know, was Rex Heuermann. He had taken Melissa's phone, he had called her teenage sister, and he had threatened her. Amanda carried that experience for 17 years before she stood up in that courtroom, and when she stood up, she was not going to let him look away. At one point during her statement, she noticed Heuermann looking down at the table rather than meeting her gaze, and she stopped speaking long enough to address him directly. She said, "You can look at me while I am talking. It has been about 17 years since we spoke. Do not forget."
You can look at me while I'm talking. It's been about 17 years since we spoke, don't forget. My sister, and the things I do to you are far worse than anything you've ever done to anyone or even thought of. And just because you have a few fans, remember, you are hated by so many. I know everyone spoke on heaven, but do me a favor, save me a spot in hell, because I'll see you there.
The courtroom fell completely silent. No one who was there that day is likely to ever forget that moment. When the victim impact statements had concluded, Suffolk County Judge Timothy Mazzei himself turned to address Rex Heuermann directly. And what he said was not the measured, carefully composed language that judges typically employ during sentencing proceedings. His voice was audibly quivering. He wiped tears from his eyes. He was, by the end of his remarks, raising his voice in a way that those in attendance said they had simply never witnessed from a judge on a bench before. He asked Heuermann whether he was even a little bit sorry for what he had done to 8 women, at least 8 that anyone knew of, women he had strangled to death. Heuermann responded faintly, barely audibly, that yes, he was. The judge was not satisfied with feint. He told Heuermann that he knew he was sorry he had been caught, and perhaps sorry for what his actions had done to his own wife and children. But he challenged him on whether any genuine remorse existed for the women themselves, and then he delivered his final summation of the man standing before him. He told Rex Heuermann that despite being described as a very big man, he was, in truth, a disgusting, despicable small man, if he could be called a man at all. He called him a coward.
I know that you're sorry that you got caught. I assume that you're sorry for what you've done to your wife and children. Are you a little bit sorry for what you did to these poor innocent women? 8 women that you strangled to death, at least 8 that we know of. Are you at least a little bit sorry for that? Yes?
Yes, I am.
You've been described as a very big man, but you're a disgusting and despicable small man, if you're a man at all. And you're a coward.
The sentence that followed was this: for the 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, Rex Heuermann was sentenced to life in prison without any possibility of parole, 3 such sentences to run consecutively. For the 4 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castilla, and Valerie Mack, he was sentenced to 25 years to life for each count, also to run consecutively. When you add just those 4 second-degree sentences together, that is 100 years. Rex Heuermann will still be legally serving his sentence long after he has drawn his last breath. He will never walk free. He will never see the outside of a prison cell again for the rest of his natural life. When the judge concluded and ordered the officers to remove Heuermann from the courtroom, the reaction from the gallery was immediate and visceral. There were cheers. There were tears. There were people clutching one another in the way that only people who have been through something together, something long and dark and almost unbearable, hold each other when it is finally over.
Anything else, gentlemen?
Nothing from the people around.
Mr. Brown?
Nothing further.
All right, get him out of here.
Rex Heuermann himself said very little throughout the entire proceedings. When the court gave him the opportunity to address those present, he stood and offered only a brief and largely hollow acknowledgement. He said there were no words he could say, that he was responsible for what had been said in that room, and that any words he might offer would have no meaning. And then he sat back down.
There are no words I can say. I am responsible for what was said in this room today. The words I would say have no meaning, and I'm going to leave it there at this time.
The man who had terrorized, hunted, and killed 8 women across 17 years had nothing more to offer the people he had destroyed. After the hearing, Lily Waterman stood before cameras at a press conference and delivered what may have been the most quietly powerful statement of the entire day. She asked the world to stop saying his name. She asked that his face stop being put everywhere. And she said, put the girls' faces there instead, put their names, make it known that they are the ones who live on.
It's been a long day coming, and from this day forward, stop saying his name, stop putting his face everywhere. Put the girls' face, put their names, and make it known that we are the ones who live on for them.
Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castilla, Valerie Mack, and Karen Vata. 8 women, 8 lives, 8 names that deserve to be remembered not because of how they died, but because of who they were. Mothers, sisters, daughters, friends, women whose voices Rex Heuermann believed he had silenced forever. He was wrong. As for whether this is truly the final chapter, that remains an open question. Investigators and legal analysts alike have noted that given the span of nearly 2 decades during which Heuermann was active, and given the geographic range of his movements, it is not impossible that additional victims exist who have not yet been identified or connected to him. The work of truth-telling in cases like this one rarely ends cleanly. But for now, on this day, justice has been delivered. A courtroom full of grieving, resilient, extraordinary people looked a monster in the eye, said what they needed to say, and watched the door close behind him forever. That is our story for today here on True Crime Web. I have heard from some of you that the way these stories are edited is one of the reasons you keep coming back. And honestly, that means more to me than I can possibly say. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you after the final frame, then I want to ask you to do something small but powerful. Join me on this journey by liking this video. And please share it with at least one person in your life. It could be a family member, a church member, a friend, your parents, your children, anyone at all. Just one share can carry this story to someone who needs to hear it, someone who may be searching for hope, for understanding, or for a reminder that justice can still be found even after the darkest of years. And if you have not already, subscribe to True Crime Web and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support is what keeps these stories alive and keeps the voices of the forgotten from fading away. Until next time, take care of yourself, hold the people you love a little closer, and stay safe. We will see you in the next one.